A few months ago, I went hiking at a state forest that I visit often. I've been there so many times, and nothing unusual ever occurred before. The forest covers nearly 2,000 acres, with long, winding trails that stretch through thick, wild trees. There are two parking lots, one on the east side and the other on the west, but they are quite far from each other. Now that day, I went to the eastern parking lot, and I was happy to see that I was the only person there, and my car was the only one in the lot. This isn't strange, because the forest is very quiet and hidden, so not many people come. That's one of the reasons I enjoy going there. I usually like to leave the main trail and explore the woods, finding spots that look untouched, or places that are really far from anything made by people. That day felt like any other. I set off with my dog on a familiar trail, enjoying the quiet. We walked about 6 miles into the woods until we came to a spot where the riverbed crossed the trail. The sound of the flowing water caught my attention, and I decided to leave the trail and follow the river deeper into the forest. The trees were thick, and the air felt cool as we moved further in, away from any sign of the trail. We kept walking along the riverbed, going about 3 more miles, surrounded by nothing but nature. As I was walking, I heard what sounded like a very distant conversation between two people. I stopped and listened, and everything around me was silent, but I could still hear the faint sound of two people talking. It was so quiet that I thought it might be an animal. Then I figured there was no reason for people to be out there, which seemed really unlikely. The sound slowly faded away, so I ignored it and continued walking. The riverbed was in a deep valley, with steep hills rising on both sides. I decided to climb the hill on the right side to get a better view of the area and then turn around, which would make my total hike about 16 miles. My dog followed as I started the climb, and it was tough. The hill was steep, and I was getting more and more tired as I went up. After what felt like a long time, I finally reached a flat area at the top, and there I spotted a large rock, sat down to catch my breath, and let my dog rest as well. I was sitting there in complete silence with my dog, when out of nowhere, I suddenly heard two people talking. But I couldn't understand a single word. The voices were coming from just around the bend near the cliff next to me. This terrified me because I was there to get as far away from people as possible. Now keep in mind that I had arrived at a secluded state forest with an empty parking lot and no other cars. You need a car to get there, and I didn't know of any other way to reach that spot. I had walked deep into the woods, far off the trail, and climbed a very steep hill to a high point when this happened. Also, it was the start of spring, and the ground was covered with at least a foot of dead leaves and twigs. My movements through the woods would have sounded very loud, like a freight train, so they should have heard me coming, and I would have heard any other sounds, but I didn't hear anything. The voices started, and then went silent within about a minute. By then I was really scared, and decided to leave as quickly as possible. But that's not where it ends. When I finally reached the riverbed again, and made my way back toward the trail I had left behind, I suddenly heard the two voices again, and this time they were making strange wolf-like cries that echoed through the trees behind me. They kept crying and howling over and over for a long time, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Even when I finally got back on the trail, I could still hear those unsettling sounds in the distance. Finally, I reached my car with my dog, and we quickly left the area. There were still no other cars in the parking lot or anywhere around, so it seems very unlikely for two people to be where I was. given the situation, though I'm not saying it's impossible. Now, it could have been some really experienced outdoorsman who had been roaming the woods for a while. But still, why were they howling? Why didn't they make any other noise? And why didn't they seem to notice me coming, which they definitely would have heard? I was a scout from age 12 to 16, and we often camped at Larch Hill in the Wicklow Mountains. The campsite was surrounded by thick forests and hills, making it both beautiful and a bit creepy at night. The scout leaders enjoyed telling us creepy stories around the campfire, and one of the most popular was about a woman who was said to haunt the area, usually called the Lady of Larch Hill. They said she wandered through the woods at night, searching for something or someone. I didn't really believe the stories at the time, and thought they were just made up. Now let me explain the campsite layout a bit. So, when you drive into the campsite, there's a large gravel parking area. On the right side, there's a welcome center and bathrooms. Straight ahead, there's a gravel path, and on both sides of it, there are entrances to fields. For this trip, we were camping in the field at the very back. There were no lights around the campsite, except by the bathrooms and outside the welcome center, which lit up the parking area. That weekend, we were camping in the back field. The mess tent was set up near the entrance of the field, which opened onto the path leading to the parking area. Our tents were spread out, and the mess tent was set up near the entrance to the field. This entrance opened onto the gravel path, which led all the way back to the parking area. At night, the only light we had was from our flashlights or the campfire, so it felt pretty creepy once the sun went down. The field faced the mountains, and to the left of the mess tent, at the bottom of the field, were our tents. One side was surrounded by trees and bushes. At that time, there were 4 girls camping in 2 small tents, and a few boys' tents were set up around us. My best friend and I were sharing a tent, and we had an argument earlier that evening over something unimportant. Even though we weren't really talking, I didn't want to walk around the campsite alone because it was so dark. The only light was near the bathrooms and parking area, and the rest of the place was pitch black. So later that night, after everyone else had gone to sleep, I asked her to come with me to the bathrooms. They were about a 5-minute walk from our campsite, and I didn't want to go by myself. She wasn't talking to me and walked about 6 feet ahead. Now we didn't use any flashlights and headed towards the mess tent because it had a single light hanging outside, lighting up part of the campsite. As we got closer, I kept my eyes on the ground to avoid tripping over tree roots or any camping gear that might have been left out for the next morning. Then I noticed the shadow of a girl to my left, about 3 feet behind me. I thought one of the other girls must have heard us leave and felt scared to walk to the bathroom alone at night, just like me. So I turned around, but there was no one there. But when I looked down, the shadow was still there. I clearly thought it was the shadow of a girl, because I could see long hair and a dress, which I guessed was a nightgown. I looked at my shadow, then at my friend's shadow, and back to the shadow next to me. I noticed something strange. The light. The only light on that cloudy night when you couldn't see the moon or stars was coming from the right. My shadow and my friend's shadow stretched out from our feet toward 10 o'clock, but this other shadow seemed to be coming from nowhere. I tried to think of every possible explanation for the shadow, but I was so scared that I closed my eyes and walked closer to my friend. We didn't say anything during the whole walk down, and the only sounds were our footsteps on the gravel and the rustling of leaves in the trees. Once we passed the mess tent and reached the path, we both turned on our phone flashlights to light the way. I felt a chill run down my spine as we walked, hoping nothing would jump out at us from the shadows. We could see lights from other campsites scattered around, but none were bright enough or close enough to help light our path. When we reached the bathrooms, I locked myself in a stall and just sat there. I waited until I heard my friend flush and unlock her stall before I finally left mine. I didn't even dare to look in the mirror while washing my hands because I was afraid I might see something I didn't want to. After that, we walked back to our tent, and I crawled into my sleeping bag without saying a word. I could hear my friend moving around, but I was too shaken to talk. I hardly slept that night, trying to figure out what had happened and if I had seen a ghost. To this day, when people ask me if I've ever had a paranormal experience, I think back to that shadow walking behind me. I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia. It's a lovely area with many miles of national forest, nice state parks, and great camping spots. I really enjoy hiking on these trails with my dog. However, it can feel a little scary sometimes because the trails can be quiet and remote. It's about a 10-mile drive from town, and there's no cell phone service or houses for miles, which makes me feel cut off from help if I need it. And in the past, there have been many vehicle break-ins at the trailheads, so I always make sure to lock my car and take my valuables with me. The gravel parking lots at some trailheads sparkle with pieces of broken glass, which I think are from car windows. And sometimes there are suspicious people hanging around these areas or driving along the Forest Service roads. These roads are very rough, and you'll often see old, worn-out cars speeding down paths that are really meant for 4x4 vehicles. Some of the people you see in the cars look like the guy who got crushed by an ATM in Breaking Bad. Despite that, it's still a great place to camp, but you just have to be careful. A few years ago, 2 of my friends and I decided to play paintball in the National Forest. We also decided to turn our paintball trip into a camping trip, so we could play again the next morning. After a pretty quiet day of shooting paintballs at each other, we drove a couple of miles to one of the more popular camping spots, but unfortunately, a church group had taken all the spots in the area. This was the only camping place we knew, and it was getting late. We decided to keep looking, so we drove for about an hour deeper into the woods. But by this time, it's getting dark, and we're starting to worry about finding a camping spot. We all had GPS on our smartphones, but none of us had any service. We turned onto an unfamiliar road that wasn't in very good shape, and it looked like the Forest Service rangers used a backhoe to block off the road with a pile of dirt. Even so, it looked like 4x4 vehicles had gone over the mound, so it was worn down. Our F-150 had good clearance, so we decided to go over the mound. On the other side, we found an old gravel road that was mostly clear of debris. We drove a few miles down this road and came across an opening next to a small creek. There were some blue tarps hanging over a plywood table nailed to a tree, which looked kind of strange. It was almost dark at this point, and we didn't want to keep driving around all night looking for a camping spot. We left the truck lights on and set up the tent. While we were putting up the tent, I noticed there was a lot of trash in the woods around the site, and I saw a green bottle lying on the ground. I looked at the label and saw that it was a bottle of home and garden insecticide. I was really tired, so I just thought someone had been dumping their trash here. But none of us found it strange that someone would dump garbage in an area. That is more than an hour from the nearest home, so we set up camp and made chili from scratch. By this time, it was probably around 11 p.m. As we were eating, we noticed a faint glow from the other side of a nearby hill. At first, we thought it was moonlight coming through the trees. However, the angles didn't make sense. It didn't look like a bright light, and it wasn't moving. It was similar to the glow you see over a bright city, but we couldn't see where the light was coming from. Since there were no other access roads nearby, we decided it wasn't other campers. The hill was about a quarter mile from our campsite, so we decided to go check it out. Normally, I know I wouldn't have done this, but we had all had a few rum and cokes, and two of us, Jacob and I, decided to take a look. My other friend Isaac decided to stay behind to pop some popcorn over the fire. We started walking toward the light source, and the situation got even stranger. All the trees in the area had their bark knocked off in a circle around their trunks. We thought it might have been a beaver from the creek, but it seemed odd that a beaver would go around all these trees and just knock the bark off in a circle. Jacob and I started talking about the ghost beaver in loud voices, probably because we were drunk. As we were almost at the top of the hill, Jacob tripped and yelled, "Oh shit!" A few seconds after he yelled, the light, or whatever it was, went out. We looked at each other and decided that maybe we didn't need to find out what that light was after all. So we walked back in silence, looking back every few seconds. We decided to turn off our flashlight and use the moonlight to get back to the campsite. When we got a couple of dozen feet from the campsite, I saw my other friend Isaac walking around. He was wearing a hooded coat I hadn't seen him wear before, but for some reason, he was carrying his paintball gear in his hand, which seemed a little strange to us. The fire had started to die down, so we couldn't see our campsite very well. And from a distance, it looked like Isaac was searching for something. He kept walking around the campsite and looking into the tent. When we were almost back, we saw Isaac walking up the road we came in on. We thought he was going to use the bathroom, so we sat by the fire and waited for Isaac to return. Then suddenly, we saw him stumble out of the tent and vomited, mumbling that he'd had a few more drinks. We asked him why he'd been wandering around the campsite with the paintball gear, but he just gave us a strange look and said it wasn't him, and the gear was locked up in the truck. We went to check the truck, entered the door code, and saw all our paintball gear just as we left it. The keys were still hidden in a magnetic fob underneath. I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. "Isaac, what were you doing after we left?" I asked. I was watching a movie on my phone, then I guess I fell asleep." "But you were walking around with your paintball gear, right? And did you change your jackets?" Now Isaac said he had been in the tent since we left, and that he had been wearing the same fleece all night. Someone had been walking around our campsite, and it wasn't Isaac. By this point, we were all too drunk to drive, but we decided to pack up and go back to my house for the night. We didn't bother packing up the tent. We just folded it down with the sleeping bags and everything inside. We jumped into the F-150, and I started to drive out. When we reached the dirt mound, we saw something gray blocking our path. The metal barrier that had been lying in the woods earlier was now back on its stand, right on top of the mound. No one wanted to get out of the car to try to move the barrier. I had a metal guard on the front of the F-150, so I slowly drove forward, gently tapping the metal barrier with the front of my truck. But we were scared it would pop one of the truck's tires, but it didn't. As we drove down the road, we saw a vehicle following us with its lights off. It was about 1,000 feet behind us, but we kept catching glimpses of it as the moonlight reflected off it. I started to drive as fast as I could on the Forest Service road, and the other vehicle kept pace with us. After about 45 minutes of speeding along the gravel roads, we finally made it back to the main paved road. I started to drive everyone back to my house, but I decided to take a different route just to be safe. I was lucky I didn't get pulled over for a DUI. Camping can be fun, but camping in very remote areas can be dangerous. I've driven past that metal barrier since then, but it has always been in place. I would never go down that road again, though.